Hey guys, this is Mitch with Fine Point CGI, and today we're gonna go through the beginnings of a larger tutorial series where we talk about how to use Blender as a game developer. So in this first tutorial, we will talk about the basic interface of Blender. We're gonna talk about how to do some basic adding items and things like that. We're going to talk about how to actually get into edit mode, which is where we can actually edit our objects. And we are going to build out a small lantern object for use in our game. So that's what I have in store for you guys today. So let's go ahead and get started.
All right, so the first thing we have to talk about is how to actually get a hold of Blender. So if you head out to the Blender website, I have a link in the description for that. This is where you can pull down Blender. Now, your first question might be, what is Blender? And that's a pretty simple question, but it's also an extremely complicated one. Blender is a tool that allows you to do all sorts of stuff. So if we scroll down on their website, you'll see that they have all sorts of things here, but it really is an awesome tool. Blender is a fully featured modeling suite. Okay. But it's not just a modeling suite. It has a built in rendering engine that is first class. It has been used in a lot of movies, it's been used in animations and TV shows and things like that. So it's a really, really powerful render engine. It also has an awesome modeling system, and we're definitely going to be using a lot of this. Now, the rendering engine will probably not use that much, but the modeling side of it, especially for game development, is huge. It has the ability for you to model and sculpt and do your UV editing, and it'll even allow you to do texture painting. So you can actually paint on your mesh and make it look like a specific object of some kind. Blender also can do VFX, which is awesome. It has a literally one of the best trackers I've ever used, and it is a really awesome workflow. A lot of times in the past, when I was in college, we would have to go and use After Effects and do some tracking in After Effects and then export that out into Maya and then do some more tracking and more changes and on and on and on. But now you can do it all inside of Blender, which is really cool and saves a lot of trouble and a lot of time, which is one of the big reasons why Blender is such a first-class program. Next is the animation and rigging side. Now, this is something that we actually will be using eventually, and that is Blender has one of the best animation systems I've ever encountered. It has this thing called a human meta rig, which basically allows you to rig your human like characters almost instantaneously. It allows you to create basically whatever you want, and it has a really great and simple to use animation system. But Blender doesn't stop right there. Blender also does drawing. You can actually draw 2D stuff in 3D inside of Blender. So you can actually, using their grease pencil system, you can literally paint and draw out things inside of Blender. So it's really nice because you can use Blender for your 3D, your VFX, your 2D, and even for video editing. They don't really have it in here, but you actually can video edit with Blender as well. So Blender is a full-featured tool that can do everything that you need to in one program. I used it as my main video editor for a very long time. And the only reason why I switched over to DaVinci Resolve was because, frankly, it wasn't getting as much support as I wanted it to at the time, and it was missing a lot of features, though I'm told a lot has changed since then. So maybe I'll come back to it. Now, this is all well and good, but how can we download it? Well, if you head up to the top right here, you should see a little download button. Go ahead and click on that, and you will see it says The Freedom to Create. Download 3.3.1, which is the version of Blender that we're using. And we will click on this, and it'll say we are breathtaking. And I can't believe Blender's on 3.3.1 One, because I remember back in the old Big Buck Bunny era and Elephant Dream era and the Sintel era, back when Blender was, I think that was Blender 2, I think 2.4 and 2.6, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time, but Blender has changed so much since then. But once you guys have it downloaded, go ahead and execute the Blender installer and it'll pop up just like this. Click next. I accept that they can steal my soul. I will click next one more time and install. And that's going to go ahead and install Blender. And once we get to the completed with Blender setup, let's click finish. And then let's hit the Windows key and type in Blender and it should pop up, providing it wants to. There we go. Awesome. So the first thing that we have to do when it comes to Blenders, we need to talk about the splash screen. This splash screen is always my favorite part of Blender. Every single time I download a new version of Blender, it always has a really cool image that is created by someone in the community. So I always appreciate when I get to see what people have been creating. Now over here on the left, you can see we have a new file, general 2D, sculpting, VFX, and video editing. And each one of these will completely change the user interface. So you want to be cautious. If you suddenly click on like video editing and you end up like this and you go, whoa, what happened to my Blender? That's because you clicked on video editing, and you can get back there just by clicking on this little button up here in the upper left and then clicking on splash screen, and that will bring this back. Now, what you want to do is make sure you have general turned on like this, and you'll want to make sure that you can see all of these different elements here. Now over here on the right, we have our recent files. In your case, this is probably empty because you guys probably haven't used Blender, or if you have, it's probably filled up with stuff. Open allows you to open, recover last session if Blender should crash, which generally it doesn't, but sometimes it does. If it does, you can click on this and attempt to recover your last session. And then of course you have release notes and development fund, which is of course donating to the Blender community and donating to the development of this application. Now, if we click off of it, like this, you will be greeted with the Blender interface. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the interface in this specific tutorial. In this tutorial, we're just going to be building out a small lantern, and it's going to be a game asset for our project. So the goal here is to teach you everything about Blender that you need to know from a game dev perspective, not from a, hey, I'm a master at Blender perspective, okay? So first up here is your top bar. This has different things. This has like your file, edit, render, window, and help. And then it also has these guys up here. And these guys are what's called interface layouts. And if you click on them, you will see that they change your entire interface based off of what you are in. Now, that's important because it's really useful for you when you're doing your game stuff, when you're doing your game development. If you're doing animation, this is a really well put together animation suite layout for you. You have a picture for your camera, you have your character or whatever it is that you're animating here, and you have your timeline down here. Whereas if you are in modeling, you don't necessarily need that timeline, right? So it's gone. And you'll see that it's been replaced with all these little buttons down here. And we've been moved to the modifier side right here, which is a common thing to be used when you're modeling. And same thing with sculpting. You'll notice that all these guys change, and this gets changed over here to your brush options. So when you're sculpting, this is a better interface than what layout would be. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, right now, we're just going to stick with the layout for right now, and we'll have a quick conversation about the general layout structure. So this is what's called your viewport. This is basically everything that you see, okay? And you can navigate your viewport really easily. So unlike Godot or any other program, you can't fly navigate. You have to do it the old-fashioned way. So what you could do is you can hold the middle mouse button, and that will allow you to rotate, okay? And if you are on a laptop, you can click on this little guy up here, and that will achieve the exact same thing. Although I really strongly would suggest that you get a middle mouse button because it's going to make your life a lot easier. Trust me. Now, if you click on these guys, you'll see that they become selected. And you can see over here on what's called your outliner, this is basically your scene, what's in this page. You can see we have a camera, a cube, and a light. And as we select them, you'll see that they select as well. And that's basically what this is for. Is it's an easy way to find the elements you're looking for. A lot of times when you're creating a level or something like that, the actual finding a specific item is very, very hard. So it's really nice to have a inspector thing that I can just kind of click on and select my objects. You can see as I select them, they get selected. Now, back to movement. If we hit the middle mouse button to rotate and then we hit shift, you'll see that we start panning away from the object. So if we hit shift, middle mouse button will let us move. Middle mouse button will let us rotate. Okay. And then the other really important way to move around, if you scroll down, you will zoom out. And if you scroll up, you will zoom in. Okay. And once you get really used to these controls, you'll be able to basically navigate anywhere inside of Blender in a matter of seconds. One of the things that I always tell people is think of the center of your viewport as an object. You are rotating around an object. So if you are way out here like this and you are rotating, you'll see that no matter how much you try, you're not on that object until you pan back like this. Even if you zoom out, so if I'm way over here, like so, and I zoom out, and then I start trying to zoom in on this object, you can see that it's a nightmare to deal with. And that's because the object that I'm rotating around is here, not over here. Now you can get that to go back by doing this and dragging it back into position. It takes a lot of getting used to, but trust me, it is totally worth it once you get used to it. Now, continuing with looking at the inspector, over here on the left right here is the tool shelf. So if I click on this little cube and I click right here, you will see that this is the move tool. So I can actually click on these guys and move this guy around just like that. And these little squares here allows me to move it on the both axes in between this little guy here. So you can see I can click and drag. And same thing with rotate. You can see there's a rotate right here. I can rotate the object like that. And if you hit control, you can also snap it. You can see that the actual tool does work pretty well. And it also reflects those changes, right? So if you hit control and you drag, you can see you have the little increment markers right there in your actual gizmo. Now, if you click on scale, you can see the same thing. You can scale on these two axes just like this. You could scale on a single axis like this. Simple enough. And if you select the center, then it gets kind of wonky, but generally speaking, you could just do it on these two axes. And then you have transform, which does all of them all at once. And you have annotate, which allows you to draw. And you have measure, which allows you to measure the size of an object. Okay. And you also have select, by the way. So you can click and drag and select. You can click and drag and select these guys like this with the circle select. And you can also do a lasso select if you wish to lasso select. So those are some of the options here on the left side. And this panel changes depending on what mode you are in. And we'll get into modes in a little bit, but just know that those are things that exist. Now, you will never see me use these ever. Pretty much in any tutorial I do, I don't use them. And the reason why is because Blender is a gigantic hotkey tool. And what I mean by that is if you use these tools, I won't be mad at you by any means, but these tools are a lot slower than just using the actual hotkeys instead. So for instance, if you wanted to use the move tool, which is this guy right here, and allows you to move these guys, instead you can just hit G to grab it, and then you can hit X to constrain it on the X axis, Y to constrain it on the Y axis, and Z to constrain it on the Z axis. So that's something to keep in mind. Now you have this object grabbed, but you don't necessarily want to leave it. And if you click, it'll stay, right? So wherever it went up there. You can just click and have it stay. So if you hit G and then click, it'll stick right there. And if you hit Control Z, it will go back. Now, if you have it grabbed and you move it, but you're like, oh no, I didn't want it over here, you can just hit escape and it will snap back to where it was. Same thing with scale, S. You can scale it on the X, the Y, and the Z. Now, just like the tools, you can actually constrain it on two axes. So if you hit, for instance, scale and then X, you would be scaling on the X axis, right? But if you hit Shift X, you constrain it on the Y and Z axes. So the way that I think of it is if you press X, it will do it on the axes. And if you hit Shift X, it will do it on all of the axes that are not the axes you selected. So it's everything but X, if that makes sense. It just excludes X, basically. Same thing with G. G does the same thing. So X, Y, Shift Z will allow you to do it like that. So that's something to keep in mind. And to rotate, you hit R and allows you to rotate, and then X, Y, Z, Shift X, Shift Y. Simple enough, right? So, like I said, in general, with hotkeys in Blender, you will always just use the hotkeys. That's not to say that you can't use these tools if you prefer them, but just know that I am going to be using hotkeys and I'll be calling them out as I go along and as I start building things. I will call out the hotkeys that I am pressing so that way you can follow along. Now, up here is all of the different options, and we're not going to go through all of them, but I'll give you a quick blurb. So, up here is mode. Currently, we are in object mode. There's edit mode, sculpt mode, vertex paint mode, weight paint, and texture paint. Now, we will get through all of these, not in this tutorial, but we will get through all of these. In this tutorial, we'll probably just do edit mode, but we will get through all of these eventually. Up here are various options. I'm not going to go into all of them just because there's a lot here. In the center is all of your snapping, origin, and proportional fall off stuff. Again, we'll go through those someday, but right now it's probably not a good time. And then over here on the right is all of your rendering options. So you can see we have stuff like viewport gizmos, so I can disable and enable my viewport stuff. And if I click this little down arrow, I can have specific stuff. So I can get rid of my navigation pane right here if I don't want to see it. I can get rid of my active tools. I can get rid of my active objects. I can get rid of my empties, things like that, which is pretty useful. Over here is your viewport overlays. So if you click on that, you will see that all of your viewport suddenly becomes almost like it's rendered. And that's really nice. And you can see you can turn it off and on. And of course, you have all of those options. So for instance, if you want to see your 3D cursor or text info or the floor, things like that, you can go ahead and change it right here. This right here is X-ray. You will not use it for a while, but when you need it, you'll know. Basically, if you click on it and there are multiple objects in a scene. So if I shift duplicate this object and I put it down here like this, and I make it slightly smaller, if I don't have it selected, right, you cannot see it unless I rotate, right? But if I click on X-ray, you can see it. And that's kind of the nice thing about this. Now I'm going to hit X to delete and delete that object. And that was basically just to show you guys how X-ray works. This button here is wireframe mode, very useful. So if I hit Control Z and bring back that object, you can see the object inside of the other object because it is in wireframe mode. It basically renders it just with the edges of an object. So if your object is super dense and has a lot of polygons in it, then you are going to have a real bad time with wireframe mode. Solid mode is solid, so you can see it's solid. The next one is look dev mode, which gives you a predetermined environment. So if you click on this, you can see there are a bunch of environments and it'll change the lighting of those objects to match. So the nice thing about this is if you are visualizing an object for like your portfolio, or if you are going out and trying to see how it reacts to different environments, it's extremely nice, especially when you use photogrammetry or something like that to create assets. It helps with having some kind of look dev mode, which is what this is called, to help you out. And then finally, rendered mode, which renders it based off of your actual scene. So if I click on this object and I move it, this little light here, you can see that the lighting updates as I move it around. So it's really quite nice. Now, they all also have their own drop downs. So you want to look at them. So you can see if I click on this one, you can see we have different drop downs: X-ray, shadow, cavity, depth of field,
different matte caps, studio lighting, stuff like that, stuff that you really, really can look at. There's a lot of really cool stuff in here. And one of my favorites is random for color because it allows you to, you know, see objects as different colors, see how they're different colors so that they're easy to distinguish. So you might see me have that on, you might see me not, but regardless, I'm going to delete this and I'll select that annotation if I can. Annotation eraser, and I will erase that annotation so it's out of my way. Now, one of the other big, most important things in here is if you hit N, they have this properties panel, also known as like a tool shelf. I can't remember the exact term for this. And basically, there's a lot of really cool stuff in here like view and create and edit and simply gone, which in my case, simply gone, Bake Lab, and MPFB are just stuff that I downloaded as add-ons, but up here we have all sorts of cool stuff like copying, pasting UVs, creating stuff like landscapes and archimeshes, and you might not have these enabled, but they are really useful. And of course the view stuff, so if you wanted to change your actual view's focal length, you can. Things like that. It's really quite useful. So I think mine was at 40. Keep it at 40. So it's a really useful thing if you want to change up your focal length or maybe an object location or 3D cursor location. It can be quite useful. And then tool is basically whatever your active tool is, some information on that tool. Now, speaking of tools on your tool panel here, let's talk about the properties panel over here on the right. The properties panel is a dynamic panel right here, and it goes from least specific to most specific, okay? And I know that this is kind of boring, and most of the stuff is stuff you're not going to care about, but we'll try to run through it quick. The first one is your active tool. So you can see this tool panel right here. It's a carbon copy of these two. So if you have this closed, this can be open and you have all of your tool options, which is really nice. Right here is your rendering stuff. In general, we're not going to use this unless we have to. We'll go through this if we ever do a rendering tutorial. This is your scene information. Again, we'll never use this unless you are doing rendering. So in our case, this is useless. This is a view layer. Again, not useful to us, but it basically is all of your render passes and all of your different view layers that when you render, what it's going to dump out for your compositing, which we'll cover someday in the future. Right here is your scene information. Again, most of this is not useful, although if you are doing some architecture development stuff, the default size of one of these squares in Blender is 1 meter. So if you are an American or a person that uses imperial measurements, you can come in here to units and change this to imperial, and that can make more sense to you as a person who uses imperial. So for instance, you could say, all right, well, I want my ceiling height to be 3 meters, right? 3 meters versus 9 feet is basically kind of how it tends to work. It's about, if I remember correctly, it's about 3 feet to a meter. So if you ever want to know the brain behind it, just, it's about 3 feet to a meter. So you could just do that conversion in your head, or you could just switch it here to imperial and bam, now you're in meters or in feet, and that's totally fine. You can also change the actual unit. So if you go to metric, you can see rotation in degrees, length in meters, kilometers, centimeters, micrometers, millimeters, mass as well, seconds, and temperature. So this is useful for when you're doing architectural modeling. So that's quite nice. Right here is your world. Again, this is something we're not going to use unless we're doing rendering, and we'll cover it if we ever do rendering. This is collection, which is what this object is. Basically, think of a collection as a folder of objects, and that's pretty much what this is for, is it's basically just all of the different options for that collection. Now you can see after this, it just seems to kind of taper off, right? We just have brush, right? Well, here's where it gets fun. If we click on this light here, you'll see suddenly it's changed. If we click on this object, you'll see it's changed again. And if we click on this camera, you will see that it's also changed. So that's something to keep in mind, is that this is all dynamic. For the most part, if you're doing asset creation, all of your stuff is going to be from here down that matters. Most of the rest doesn't really matter, but from here down it does. Now, this is your object properties. So it's just stuff like size, collections, information like that. This is your modifiers. We definitely will be covering that a little bit later in this tutorial. Here is your object particle properties. So if you're doing any particle systems or things like that, and again, that might not be super useful for you in
game design, but it can be useful. Over here is physics. Again, it's not super useful to us. Maybe cloth physics will be useful, but these are really cool because you can add in like fluid physics, cloth physics, rigid body, dynamic painting, stuff like that, which is really nice. Right here is object constraints. This is awesome for when you're doing rigging, and we will cover this someday in the future. I can tell you that for sure. Clicking on this one is all of your actual mesh property. So one of the things that about Blender that's different than your brain might understand at first is there are objects and then there are mesh, and there are two different things. Objects contain meshes. Meshes do not necessarily live in object, if that makes sense. So you could have a object that has multiple instances of the same mesh, and that's still valid within Blender. So just keep that in mind. Now this is where where the information of this object or of this mesh exists. So you can have stuff like name, vertex groups, shape keys, and all the rest of all of this. And this is stuff that is not useful for this specific tutorial, but just keep in mind that they exist. Now click on the next one is material. So for instance, if we are in our look dev mode up here, and we come in here and we come down here to metallic and we make this object very metallic, you will see that suddenly it looks like it's almost made of metal. And then if you drop down the roughness, you can see that now it's becoming more like a metal object. And if we bring down the roughness all the way, you will see that we have almost a mirror like effect. And that's basically what this is all about, right? Is that's what materials are for. They define the material of the object. Now, you may or may not use this in your project, but I can tell you that in game development in general, you will be using this a lot. So just be sure to learn this panel, and we can definitely get into this in a little bit. Now, if we head over to the texture panel, that's what this one is, and that's the last one. And that is basically any textures that are associated with this object. Now, that's pretty much it for this panel. Now, as you can see, it goes from least specific to most specific. Textures make up materials, materials make up objects, objects make up constraints, constraints make up physics, physics makes up particles, particles can be made up of modifiers, and modifiers are all contained into an object. And then, of course, objects go in collections, collections go into worlds, worlds go into scenes, scenes go into rendering layers, and rendering layers go into your render. And that's basically how this works. So just keep that in mind. And of course, if you click on the light, these are also different. You'll notice that it's the same all the way down until we get to object constraints. And then we have light properties as well. And then same thing with camera. If you click on camera, we have the camera properties. So those are some things to keep in mind. Now, once we have our property panel kind of figured out, let's figure out how to build something small. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset our scene a little bit. I'm going to hit A to select everything and hit X and delete it. Now, the object that we are going to be building is going to be a small lantern for our character to hold on to while they are walking around. So what is the lantern going to look like? I'm thinking I've Googled vintage oil lantern, and this is about what we have. So I think we'll build something similar to this guy here. And you'll notice that it's all pretty much the same exact style of shape. It's all cylinders. So what we'll do is I'll drag this guy over here to my other monitor here, and I will start adding in a cylinder. So how do we add an object in Blender? Well, you can come up to add, and then you can add a mesh and add in a cylinder. Or if you prefer, you can hit Shift A, add, cylinder, click. Now, this object is going to be close to the player, right? So we're going to want to make sure that the polygon count is fairly high, but we don't want to make it so that it's way too high. So what we should do is we should reduce the resolution of this object. And when you add in an object, you can see here on the left, there is an add cylinder menu here. So you can see there's a vertices, radius, depth, cap fill, and align. So what we could do is we could change the vertex count to 20. And if we want to adjust the radius, we could adjust the radius to whatever we want. In my case, I'll keep it at 1. That's fine. And our depth, we'll just make it nice and short. So we'll go with 0.5 or so, like that. And that's really nice because when you instantiate the object, it automatically allows you to just like adjust all those things, and it makes things really nice. Now, this is really cool, but we really can't build much while it's kind of like these objects, right? They just kind of exist, but it's not really doing anything. That is where edit mode comes in. So you can either do one of two things. You can come up here to object mode and go into edit mode, or you can just hit the tab key and suddenly you're in edit mode. Now, edit mode has completely changed everything about Blender. So everything we discussed earlier is totally different. Well, at least when it comes to the viewport. So if you look over here on the left, all of these options has changed. You'll see that all of these options has changed and all of these options have remained the same. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this. You guys can mess with these guys and see what's out there. But what I will talk about are these three guys up here because they're very important. So this is vertex selection mode. One of the things that's really important to know about 3D is objects are made up of vertices, edges, and faces. Okay. A vertice is this guy. This little guy right here is considered a vertice, okay? And a vertice is a point in space that exists, okay? An edge, which if I click on this guy, I can select edges. An edge is two vertices that are connected to each other, okay? Two vertexes that are connected. And then a face is four edges, or three, technically, that are connected to each other, okay? And you'll see that if I select one vertex and I select a second vertex, I select that edge. And same thing, if I select all four vertices, it selects that face. And if you can't see it, I'll just shut that guy off and you can see that's selected. Whereas if I unselect this guy and I select this guy, there you go. Now, how do you select multiple guys, right? Well, if you hold shift, you can select multiple ones and select that face. Okay. Now, if you wanted to switch between these modes, so selecting faces, selecting edges, things like that, if you want to switch between them really quickly, you can use the 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard. So 1 is at vertex mode, 2 is edge mode, and 3 is face mode. So just remember that 1, 2, 3 is what you're looking for when it comes to the different selection methods. Now, if you go to face selection mode and you select this big old face here, which is called an N-gon, and you want to pull this guy up, you can hit G, Z, and you will see that you can pull him up and down, which is pretty cool. So if you drag this guy up and scale it, now we're kind of getting to the, the shape that we're looking for, right? Kind of. But we need to add more resolution to this object, right? We need to add more lines. So how can we add more lines? Well, what we can do is we can hit Control R to add a loop cut in, and then we click and we'll go into slide mode. We can drag this guy down to about here and then scale it out to make that a little bit fatter and a little bit nicer. And then we can grab this guy and let's just kind of drag him up. So that way it's more of that shape we were looking for, right? Now, what if I just wanted to pull this guy up, but add in a line? What I can do is I can do what's called extruding, okay? So if I drag this guy down, something like this, and let's scale this guy out with S. If I hit E, or if I click on this guy, if I hit E, I can pull this up, okay? So we can pull this guy up like this and then scale it down like that. And then I can hit E, G, and bring it up and then scale it out. E, bring it up like that. E, and then if I click E and then I right click and then I hit S, I can scale this guy out. E, up, click. And then if I hit I to inset, E, and scale this guy in like that. And then I'm going to want to relief this a little bit so it's a little bit nicer. So let's do this. Control R. Control R. And there we go. We have ourselves a very basic lantern. Kind of. So that wasn't too hard, right? So what have we done here? Well, we've tabbed into edit mode. We've controlled R to loop cut, right? We've extruded with E, and we've built ourselves a really simple object. And if you've gotten this far, congratulations, you know probably about 80% of Blender at this point, or at least 80% of the basics of Blender. So now we just need to get this object to actually have like a little hook for the player to be able to hold on to it. And we probably should get some kind of innards in here. So if we kind of zoom in, you can see it's just kind of blank. So here is some really fun things we can do. First, if we hit tab to get out of edit mode and we hit shift A and we add in a cylinder and we drag this guy up here, we can scale this down, rotate it like this, scale it down a little bit more and kind of rotate it a bit more. And then we could tab into edit mode, hit 3 on our keyboard, click on this side and this side with shift, hit X, and we can delete that face. And that's going to expand this little guy. Now we're going to talk real quick about modifiers. Modifiers is a way of being able to modify an object without directly affecting the geometry. Okay. We come over here onto the right and we click on this little wrench tab. We click on modifier. You can see there are a bunch of modifiers. And the one we're specifically looking for is solidify. So if we click on that, you can see that suddenly this object has a little bit of depth to it. And if we increase the thickness like this, now we suddenly have a little handle for our object. But with this, we now have a small handle on our object. Now, in real life, this part here and this part here and this part here are all separate. So how can we separate these? Because this is made of glass, this is made of metal, and this is made of metal, right? If we select this object and tab into edit mode, and then if we select this object here, so we can actually hit B to box select, or we can just drag, click and drag to select. We can hold shift and just select all of these guys and hit P to separate, P for separate by selection. And now it's considered a separate object. So I can actually select this guy and grab him. We select this guy and we click on this little eyedropper here, this little eye icon. We can hide it and then we can select this guy and hit tab. And then if we select all of these guys all the way around, we'll be able to face this object, okay? So what we can do is we can hit 2, select, shift, click, 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 and kind of work our way around. Or we could do what's called a loop select. And if we do a loop select, that's Alt, Shift, click, and it will have selected it all for us. And we can just hit F to face it. And now suddenly we have a solid base and we can do the same thing up here. So Alt click, face. And now we have an object that has a bottom and a top. Awesome. Now we can just add in our little internals, right? We have some internals here that we need to work with, right? So we could do is we can hit Shift A, add in a mesh, add in a cylinder, and let's change this down to something like 12. And let's scale it down, grab it on the Z-axis, bring it up, and let's kind of make it so that it matches. So we'll scale it along the Z-axis, and we'll need to make it just a bit smaller. So scale it like this. Somewhere in here, tab into edit mode, hit 3, click, E, escape, scale it down, and I'm just going to pull this up just a tiny bit with GZ, and then I'm going to hit E, E, click, scale it out like so, and then E, scale it in like so, pull it down like that. And actually looking at this, let's say Control Z, Control Z. Let's give this a little bit more depth. So we'll just kind of do this, E, scale it, E, scale it down, and then bring it down. There we go. That's going to look a lot nicer. Now we have ourselves a little bit of an internal piece here. And now we can hit Shift A, add in a cube. We can scale this guy down, grab it up like this, scale it along the Y axis, tab 3, click, grab this guy up, something about here for a wick, and then we'll give it a little bit of personality by hitting Control R, clicking, and grabbing this along the Y axis, Control R. Click, click, drag it along the Z axis or the Y axis. And there we go. There, we got a nice little lantern here. And now, if we select our cylinder and unhide it, and then if we come over here to our modifiers and add in a solidify modifier like this, and if we select our top guy and hide it real quick, this is glass, right? So we'll just add a tiny bit of thickness to our glass. And in general, for our game, this might not be useful, but for this, it's going to be kind of cool because I'm going to show you guys some cool stuff later. But that's basically all we need to do. Now, that being said, the glass needs to be molded technically to match this. So what we can do is we can tab into edit mode of this guy and we can just kind of extrude. If we go into wireframe, you can see our wireframe here. We can extrude this guy down like so, Control R, and scale this out for a little bit of a bump like that. If Blender wants to play nicely, we can scale that out. And then we can select this guy, tab, Control R, bring it up here like so, and scale this guy out as well. And we have to do the same thing down here. So let's select this guy, wireframe mode 3. If we select this guy and hit E, Z, Control R, bump that bad boy out, click on this guy, Control R, bring this down, Control R, and bump this guy out as well. And hit Alt, click, scale this guy, Alt, click, scale this guy. And we have ourselves a very basic lantern. Now, right now, looking at this object is pretty decent. It's actually not that bad, right? Now, if we come over here and we click on this little guy here and we go to statistics right here, you can see we have 1,488 triangles. Now, this is not awful. It's not great. Something that I've always been told is your polygon models should be somewhere between, it really can range, but 50,000 polygons is considered decently high. If you want something for like a game prop, usually 1,000 to 20,000 is considered okay. I like to try to keep it lower than that if I can, but that's just kind of some ballpark estimates here. Now right now, these objects are very, very, very rough. You can see that they're just kind of flat like this. You see how it has these flat edges here. And what we can do is we can tell the computer to shade it as if it's smooth. And what we can do is come up to Object and click Shade Smooth. And we can do the same thing with this. Object, Shade Smooth. And if we hide this object and select this guy, Object, Shade Smooth, and you will see suddenly everything will look somewhat decent. See that? Oh, and we missed this guy up here. So Object, Shade Smooth as well. Cool. Now, we do need to actually shade some of this flat, right? So like the bottom needs to be shaded flat. You might be able to want this lip to be shaded flat if you feel like it, but definitely this bottom piece. So if we hit tab and hit 3 and then click on the bottom, we can go into face, shade flat, and that will flatten that out and make it nice and sharp. See that? Cool. So now we basically have a little lantern for our player. And we can take this, hit Control S in Blender, and come out to our project. So in my case, it's Documents, Godot Horror Game C#, and we will put this under Models, and we will say lantern.blend like that and save. Now, if we open up Godot here, as soon as it's done importing, there we go. You can see if we head over to our models, you can see we have a lantern.blend. So if we go to our player and we go to where our Omni light is, if we drag our lantern.blend in here, you'll see we have a gigantic lantern, and that's because of our object size. Remember, if you look at Blender, each one of these squares is a meter. So this object should be a just a tenth of the size, right? It should be a lot smaller. It should probably be somewhere in like here kind of range, right? But we'll keep it like this for right now. So if we take this object and we scale it down in Godot here, so we just kind of scale this guy down nice and small, and we drag him down like this, and you will see that we have an object, which is really cool. So now if we hit play on our project, you'll see we have an object. See? So now I can crouch and use my lantern. So at this point, I've given you guys a lot of stuff to chew on. Now, there is so much more to Blender than this, but I've given you the very basics of Blender, and we are going to continue this model in the future. But I believe I'm probably about an hour into this tutorial, and I don't really want to make it much longer than I have to. So we'll pick this up in a follow-on tutorial, probably in the next couple of days, that will cover materials and Boolean modifiers and stuff like that. We'll make this into a really nice lantern. But for right now, that is all I have for you guys today. So thank you so much again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks.